We are renewing Britain. But I know that too many people in too many parts of our country are yet to feel it.
That's the Chancellor outlining her spending review that the government have been talking about for months. But what will it mean for me and you? Rachel Reeves stood up in the Commons for 45 minutes and told us all how the government will spend its money over the next 3 years.
The priorities of this spending review are the priorities of working people. To invest in Britain's security, in Britain's health, and to grow Britain's economy so that working people are better off. That is my choice. That is Labour's choice.
It sounds like a dry spreadsheet exercise, but it is important. The spending review outlines what Labour's priorities are for the rest of their time in office, the winners, health, defence, affordable housing, and big infrastructure projects. I'm Tamara Cohen and this is the Sky News Daily, and today we're asking, will you and I really notice the difference? And with me is Ed Conway, our economics and data editor. Hi Ed.
Hello, you all right?
Good. Well, we've been trying to digest quite a lot of information that the Chancellor's given us. I guess the first question is really, what have we learned today? Was there anything in here that we weren't expecting or anything that's come as a bit of a surprise?
I mean, in short, no. They weren't dramatic changes. They were kind of predictable. Health goes up, not enormously in comparison to previous years, but certainly goes up. Education goes up a bit in the short run and then not so much in the next years. But it was a few percent in most of these cases. So no, there wasn't a surprise on that front. I think that the second area where maybe people were thinking what's maybe not the jeopardy, but what are the big question marks about where the money is going to go was capital spending. So you've got your day-to-day spending, that's the biggest chunk, and then you've got this other chunk that's spending on investments. And there, we knew that the total amount on capital spending was going to be big in comparison to previous years, and indeed it is. What we didn't know was where that was going to go. And that was why you had this kind of strange, I mean, almost surreal experience of watching Rachel Reeves just, trotting out hundreds of numbers.
One thing after another that sounded massive, sounded like loads of spending.
It sounded like loads of spending. You couldn't make head or tail of it. We were all sitting there, and I know other people like Paul Johnson from the IFS were kind of sitting there, just scratching our heads going, this makes no sense whatsoever, even though there's like lots of good news stories in there, because it just sounded like one number after another. And only now are we able to kind of look into the numbers. And, it turns out defence, as predicted, gets a lot of money. We're spending more on transport. And back to your question you asked, a long time ago, will we notice the difference? I mean, we are seeing a genuine increase in spending on public services. Is it massive? No. Is this anything like what we saw, for instance, the last big moment where the government kind of stepped in and said, right, we're going to just spend more money was a long time ago, 25 years ago in 2000. So Gordon Brown, in the first few years of being a chancellor from 97 to around 2000, was like, I'm the prudent chancellor, put the public finances back into order, and then did this enormous splurge. And that's why you had really people noticing the NHS was better than it was, for a long time. Sure Start and lots of education programs meant that, education was improving as well. The quantity, the scale of the numbers we're talking about in this spending review, they're nothing like that Gordon Brown period.
It's quite modest, isn't it? And now let's take this apart a bit, because you've got, as you said, two things, day-to-day spending and then capital spending. So day-to-day spending, one of the big themes of Rachel Reeves' speech, which I thought was interesting for the fact that it wasn't gloomy. She's moved away from doom and gloom and tough decisions towards there's optimism there. And she said day-to-day spending is going up, department spending, by 2.3%. Which sounds like a decent increase, but it's not all equal. So you've got more than that for health and defence, and some departments are getting a bit of an increase, but it's not huge, like schools, for example, where it is an increase, but a lot of it's going to be taken up by, for example, pay or spending on special educational needs. And some departments which are not protected are going to have cuts. So in terms of on the day-to-day stuff, whether people are going to see public services improve, in theory, the NHS is a big winner, isn't it? They're getting those waiting lists down. They are putting the money into it. But there isn't much money for social care, and the NHS says a lot of this might get kind of swallowed up anyway, given it's not huge compared to the increases they've had in the past. So I think, she's saying not austerity, but it's also not a splurge.
It's not a splurge, and I think the interesting thing is, like, take schools for instance. Okay, you can see that schools gets kind of quite a big increase in the first year or two. And then it's basically flatlining. And in fact, in real terms, schools just kind of almost decreases towards the end of 2028, 29. So it's not that great by the end of the Parliament. It's not a splurge, but it's not austerity. I think that perhaps was the thing that they might have been nervous about, is that we would all be looking through and saying, well, this department, it will feel like austerity. This department will feel like austerity. I mean, there are probably some examples, and part of the tricky thing in navigating today is normally on these big fiscal moments, you tend to have the Office of Budget Responsibility kind of standing up the moment after the Chancellor and saying, look, well, here's the stuff that's really going on behind the scenes. This time around, we don't have that. They are policing their own numbers.
These are the government's numbers that they've given us. And also when we see a big number, so we've got Ed and I have got this chart in front of us with all the names of all the departments and a number in billions for each year of the next 3 years going forward. But within that, we don't know exactly how the money is going to be spent, and those departments will need to make some decisions there. And there's also this other issue about efficiency, because there's another chart that says departments will also need to save money, and that's all departments, including the NHS. They'll need to save money by being more efficient, and we don't know how they're going to do that either.
Every single spending review, by the way, since the invention of spending reviews, has had something about efficiency in it. So yeah, I mean, which is important, but
hard to
not
achieve.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now we want to move on to the capital spending. So I think Rachel Reeves keeps saying if you want expensive things, you have to pay for them, and that was why, for example, they cut the winter fuel allowance, made all these difficult decisions. Now with capital spending, it's different, isn't it? That can be borrowed, and it's for big things. It's for railways, it's for nuclear power stations, it's for things which take a very long time to build. And actually, the biggest ticket item on capital spending is nearly £40 billion for affordable homes, and that, the sector say, is going to make a really big difference. Why do governments commit to things for 10 years, Ed, when they're only going to be in power for 5? I mean, can we take this really seriously?
Well, I mean, yeah, no, it's a good point. I think, in short, because when it comes to capital spending, when it comes to doing a project, it just takes years to build it. So particularly with homes, you need to get planning. As anyone who knows who's been through this process, you need to get planning permission. You need to go and get the equipment that you need. You need to get the builders and the construction people to actually build stuff. Same thing, writ large with building a hospital or dare I say, something like high speed too. Building anything big takes a long time. And
guaranteeing that money, I guess, gets the spades in the ground, gets the private sector investors thinking it's really going to happen and kind of just moves things along.
Yeah. And back to your point, in the question, I mean, what the Chancellor did when she came into office was she changed her fiscal rules, and it gave her an enormous amount more that she could borrow, like you say, to invest. So the money that she was talking about today, a lot of that money for building stuff, that's borrowed money. So the government will be borrowing that money, but on the assumption that if you're borrowing to build something that might make the economy, more vibrant and, positive in the future, or even, you could make the case that more hospitals will ensure that people's health is better, which in turn means that they are able to work more, which is good for the economy. In theory, all of that should boost economic growth. In practice, we just don't really know until it happens. And so it's easy to be kind of, sniffy about it right now. But theoretically, building more roads that make it easier for someone to get to work will mean that people can work more, at the margin. So that all makes lots of sense. In general, actually, it's funnily enough, the OBR, when they're looking at this stuff, they typically tend to say, it's all very well kind of saying you're going to spend X on this, but actually making it happen is far harder than just putting some numbers in a spreadsheet. And I think that's particularly the one with housing. Okay, so we still, they're budgeting all this money for housing. A lot of that is all about kind of trying to improve planning, trying to kind of encourage people to build homes. The government themselves are not building any homes. So we're not back to that period back in the kind of, the 50s, 60s, 70s where the government was building lots of council housing.
It's housing associations.
It's housing associations.
Building or even buying them, aren't they?
Exactly. And so and that's quite different. And we have never seen the kind of house building totals that we saw back in those days without a large amount of public sector actual construction of homes. There wasn't anything in here that would radically change the shape of the state. It's gradualism. And I think for a lot of people, that's kind of reassuring because they would want to see gradualism. But it's not dramatic.
Radical. And I think that's a really important point about this, isn't it? That this whole exercise, telling us what they're spending for the next 3 years, tells us where Labour's priorities lie. Are they going to do the things they promised when they got elected? And what things are simply not going to be achieved? And I think it's obvious that they've put money into some areas, health and defence, but there are some areas which are either losing out or were not really mentioned at all. One of the big rows in government in the run-up to this was about funding for the police. We had a lot of noises from police chiefs and from individual forces in the newspaper saying we really need more money because the government promised at the election 13,000 more neighbourhood police. They said tackling antisocial behaviour on high streets and so on is a big priority. Now, we know there have been rows behind the scenes, but the Home Office has ended up with less money over the next few years than they've got now, haven't they? And
I mean, you can tell that there was sensitivity about this, okay? Because when you look, and I'm looking at it now, when you look at the tables that have all of the spending totals, you've got the Home Office. So each department has its total amount, and you've got billions of this and so on and so forth. You've got the Home Office there, and the number is not that great. In fact, it's terrible, really. The average real growth rate is minus 1.7% in the coming years. Then you look down, they've added this extra line going, of which Home Office, and then there's a memo below that other line saying, memo, police core spending power. And when it comes to police core spending power, that's going up. And so I think the point here is they want to say, look, there is extra money for the police, but the rest of the Home Office is just going to have to lump it.
Now, the Conservative attack on this was this can't be afforded, that Rachel Reeves is going to have to raise taxes in the autumn budget in order to pay for all of this. Is that likely?
So when we're talking about spending reviews, you're looking at a very specific bit of what the government actually does. So normally when it comes to the budget, you're looking at the taxes that they're bringing in or that we're paying. You're looking at the amount of borrowing they have to do. You're looking at the totality of spending. And remember, when the government spends money, it's not just spending money on the NHS, it's also spending money on pensions, on public sector pensions, it's spending money on the state pension, it's spending money on benefits, it's spending money on debt interest. All of that stuff wasn't considered today. Really, we were considering one fraction of its total spending. And the upshot of that is there is a lot of other stuff that you need to think about. And that other stuff, like, for instance, winter fuel payments, that other stuff is likely to come back to haunt the government in the coming months, let alone the big economic kind of picture, the macroeconomy right now. You've got a trade war happening right now. I mean, it might be that ends, but it might be that it gets worse. And if it gets worse, there's a very real possibility that that pushes the UK into kind of, maybe not a recession, but certainly weaker times in future. And if that happens, then there's less money for everyone. I think it's a very reasonable kind of criticism to say you've left yourself very little room against your fiscal rules, for instance, if anything went wrong, or if indeed any of these ambitions aren't kind of manageable. And if that does go wrong, then now that you set out your spending, the only alternative is to raise taxes or borrow more. But obviously you can't borrow more if you've got these fiscal rules. So the point being that this kind of might pen Rachel Reeves in the future and mean that the only lever she has left if something goes wrong in the next few years is to tax more. And that, I mean, no one knows. No one knows. Even the Conservatives or even the government don't know if that's going to happen right now. But they do know that they're sailing close to the line.
No, and yesterday she was questioned by journalists and she didn't actually rule out further tax rises, although she said
But she said so many times after that first budget, she said, this is the only one. I'm not coming back. I think she even explicitly said no more tax rises, or at least something along those lines. And now that stuff is going to come back to haunt her because it's a hostage to fortune. You just don't know what's going to happen.
Other thing I wanted to touch on just before we sort of sum it all up is where the money is being spent geographically, I thought was interesting. So you've got quite a few of the announcements in the last few days. So rail in Wales got a big boost, over 400 million for that. You talked about the Northern Powerhouse. There was a lot of the nuclear power station will be in Suffolk. There was a lot of investment in areas where, and this is not entirely a cynical point, but where Labour may be vulnerable to reform, to people not.
Gosh, who knew?
People thinking perhaps we haven't seen the return on our investment voting Labour, and that's caused a bit of anger actually among London MPs. I've heard from London MPs saying, hang on a minute, why are we sort of being told that we're, everything's great here and we have to give money to the north of England and the Midlands? And so there is, and I noticed Rachel Reeves also spent some time having a go at Nigel Farage over his unfunded spending commitments, which was a bit odd because he's only got 5 MPs and it didn't feel massively necessary. But there is a question here about where the money is being spent, isn't it?
The paradox there is, I think that makes kind of a lot of sense, and that these are areas that maybe haven't had as much investment as they could have done in the past. It's a levelling up. It's levelling up, in a different guise. But I think other people would say, okay, that's fair enough. But you said, a few months ago that you were all about growth. You had a growth speech. And it was like, who cares about everything else? It's growth that matters. Well, if strictly speaking, it's all about growth, then probably, like it or not, you'd be putting more money into places which are growing fastest at the moment, generating the most GDP, which happens to be kind of London and the southeast. And so again, it's not altogether clear that it's very joined up. And this is the thing with Rachel Reeves. You're never quite sure, and for that matter, Keir Starmer, you're never quite sure which policy-making individual you're getting on any given week, because they've said that they're very into growth, but they've also said by the same token they're very into kind of skewing investment into places that might not be kind of very growth positive. They said that they're very into defence, but they've also said that they're very into health. These aren't kind of binary decisions, clearly, but it's not altogether clear which of these individuals turned up today. Probably it wasn't the growth positive one. But that being said, I mean, theoretically, spending more money on investment should be growth positive, because if you're putting more cash into making our infrastructure better, then that should mean that we as a country are able to grow faster.
And we're always criticising governments for not making these big long-term decisions. So there were quite a lot of big long-term decisions in this spending review. But I think that takes us back to the question, will people feel the difference in, Rachel Reeves said, their everyday lives, jobs and high streets? Now, in some ways, they will, but not for a long time. So if the affordable housing programme pans out, in 10 years' time, we'll have a lot more affordable housing, and it may be near to some of these new job opportunities created by transport and nuclear power stations. But in terms of our everyday experience of using the NHS, schools, which we know are under a lot of strain at the moment, it sounds like the difference. And they admitted this when they got in, that you can't make a difference overnight, that, all these years of austerity have taken a toll, the pandemic, but it will be slow to improve, won't it?
I think so, yeah. There's no dramatic game changer or in any of these departments. Maybe defence is the biggest one. Schools, like I say, it's not that great, the settlement for schools. If you look out beyond the first year or two, it's not that great at all. I think they'll have to come back and provide more money or do something at some point. And
also
health,
defence. We may have to go further. I mean, NATO are pressuring countries to go further, and this spending review only talks about 2.6%, when NATO are talking about 5%. So it may be that there's pressure within government over the next few years to also shift.
It may be. It may well be. And again, they've done the maximum they felt they had to do at this point. They haven't gone beyond anyone's expectations on anything, on defence, on health, certainly on education, on the Home Office. They've probably done less than expected. So it wasn't dramatic and it wasn't bold, but perhaps for some people that's kind of what they were hoping for, something that didn't completely kind of change the nature of the state, and that's what we got. So
there wasn't any slash and burn either. No department has had really, really difficult cuts on the scale that they did during the coalition years, for example.
It was not austerity. And it's worth saying as well, although this was a zero-based review, the small print to that, which in other words, examine every bit of your spending, the small print to that is if a department found that it was, spending too much on paperclips, then it was allowed to take that money, that paperclip money, and spend it on another bit of their department. So it wasn't like you were kind of really had much jeopardy there, which seems like a little bit of a cop-out if you're, trying to police public spending.
And it's important to say that a lot of the decisions about exactly how much this money will exactly where this money will be spent, departments have yet to take. They can decide, the Home Office have said they're pleased with the money they've got, for example, for borders and border policing, but they've got £680 million for that. But clearly on sort of community police, it's not been so good. So I think within departments, there may still be sort of some big decisions to make over the coming years about how exactly that pie gets cut up. But yes, she's promised a real difference. Some of that real difference may be positive. Some of it may not be felt at all. And some of it may actually be quite tricky.
I think the big question now is, so at what point do they have to start revisiting some of this in the face of whatever next crisis comes up? Because it would be shocking if, it's great to have a multi-year spending review, which is the whole point of this is let's not just do this stuff 1 year at a time. Let's allow governments to make plans for the future. But in practice, things are going to happen. I mean, COVID, dare I say, who knew that was going to happen? Who knew we're going to get a trade war this year? There's a lot of things that could surprise us in the coming years. So it's the story's not over yet.
Yeah, the best laid plans. Well, thank you so much, Ed. That was really great. That's it for today. You can find out more about how the spending review impacts you on our website, news.sky.com. The Daily is back tomorrow.